got it lucky, don't they, Mom?
Why do you say that?
Well, they don't have to be smart. They don't have to get jobs or anything. All they gotta do is get married.
Well, Beaver, today girls can be doctors and lawyers, too, you know.
You mean there's no dumb people left in the world, Mom?
When you think of a housewife, what do you picture? A 1950s blonde making her husband dinner, a frazzled, overtired woman running after her toddler, a modern, fresh-faced woman happily cooking, cleaning, doing laundry, and taking care of the kids with ease on some sort of farm? I guess whatever you may imagine is how you view the work of a housewife. If you think it's an easy, relaxing job where you just get to stay at home all day and play with your kids, then you imagine the blonde or the happy woman who is doing her biologically destined job of nurturing and cleaning. But if you know how hard it is to be the default parent, particularly a stay-at-home mom in today's day and age in the US, you know that the worn-out, dejected mom is closer to most women's actual realities. Being a stay-at-home mom, you're not only a mom giving round-the-clock childcare, you're also a cook, a housekeeper, a chauffeur, and more all rolled into one. It's hard work that goes largely unappreciated, and it's mostly done by women. According to Oxfam, women reported doing more than 3/4 of unpaid care work globally when compared to men and make up 2/3 of the paid care workforce. They carry out 12.5 billion hours of unpaid care work every day. When valued at minimum wage, this would represent a contribution to the global economy of at least 10.8 trillion a year. Many stay-at-home parents work around the clock. If you have young children, work can often mean nighttime feedings, greeting early morning risers, and late night meal prep.
We're parents with no support. We feel guilty taking breaks because it puts all the responsibility on the other one.
And this isn't to say that stay-at-home moms hate their kids or their role as the default parent, but just that caregiving and domestic labor is work that never really gets appreciated because it's just women's work. It's just what you're supposed to do as a woman. And didn't you want kids? Being a mom who gets to stay at home and be with her kids all day is amazing. Why are you complaining? And this hurts even more when coming from other women, especially trad wife mom influencers whose job it is to sell you this dream of housewifery and motherhood without disclosing that they're getting paid to do so. Ultimately, they're the hypocrites because though they're stay-at-home moms, they're also work-from-home moms. They make an income and have a job which they're telling you to give up. The majority of housewives and mothers who have to stay at home don't have time to make highly curated and filtered content of themselves cooking meals from scratch, and in fact, though we like to think of housewives as women married to rich men who can afford to stay home on one income, many stay-at-home moms are immigrants and from the lower class. In 2014, a Pew Research study showed that in the US, stay-at-home mothers are younger, poorer, and less educated than their working counterparts. For example, 34% of stay-at-home mothers are poor, compared with 12% of working mothers. They're also less likely to be white and more likely to be immigrants. And according to a new Institute for Family Studies analysis of the 2017 American Community Survey, mothers married to husbands who work full-time and year-round, the population most likely to have the option of staying home, they found there's a U-shaped curve between a mother's chances of being out in the labor force and her husband's earning income. That is, the Real Housewives of America are most likely to be found among women married to men earning just a little or quite a lot. Close to half of mothers whose husbands earn $250,000 or higher a year, 46%, are not in the labor force. On the other end of the income spectrum, 35% of mothers whose husbands make less than $25,000 a year are stay-at-home moms. Mothers married to husbands with an income between $50,000 and $75,000, the group that includes the median husband's income of $60,000, are the least likely to stay at home. And even if you want to re-enter the workforce after giving birth due to lack of maternity leave, it's a lot harder to do so, and most women have at least 1 year without any earnings. About 43% of women workers had at least 1 year with no earnings. This is at least twice the rate of men, according to the Institute of Women's Policy Research, and the penalties of taking time out of work are high. For women who took just 1 year off from work, their annual earnings were 39% lower than women who worked all 15 years between 2000 and 2015. And because of rising childcare costs, most families can't afford to send kids to daycare, so one parent must give up their career, and it's usually, guess who? the mom, who already isn't supported after giving birth by her employer, and due to the gender pay gap, will probably never make as much as her husband. Aside from economic factors, women are also encouraged to stay at home and give up their careers due to this sexist socio-cultural norm that women are just naturally more nurturing as a parent. So, because of the way the US employment, healthcare, and childcare systems are set up, along with gender norms, more times than not, it's the lower income mother who has to stay home because her husband just makes more money. However, there are a few moms who re-enter the workforce and are the main breadwinner, with a stay-at-home dad. And in fact, women in the US are now more highly educated than their male peers. In 2021, the census estimated that 21.1 million Americans were enrolled in college. About 12 million of them were female and about 9.2 million were male. That's a difference of about 2.6 million, or 56 to 44% split. In other words, the current figures certainly suggest that the gap is only likely to grow in the coming years. And when it comes to earnings, a 2019 Pew Research study found that about 16% of all young women who are working full-time year-round live in 22 metros where women are above or at parity with men when it comes to wages. There's this geographic dichotomy as well, where women make more in stereotypically more politically liberal cities as opposed to more conservative rural areas. As a work-from-home mom myself of a toddler, I'm on a lot of parenting forums, and this class dichotomy between wealthy career moms and poorer stay-at-home moms really caught my attention because it disrupted at least my own notion of what stay-at-home moms look like. To me, a stay-at-home mom was a wealthy white wine mom in a city suburb, but in fact, that type of woman today is more likely to work outside the home, and it's poor married women who are more likely to stay home. What shocked me the most was the amount of poor stay-at-home moms with no job and no income who were mainly posting about how frustrated they are as stay-at-home moms due to the fact that they have no village and their husband is working non-stop all week, and when their husbands are home, they need to rest and recharge, meaning they can't help out with childcare or domestic responsibilities. The following posts are from the Mom Forum What to Expect, a US-based pregnancy and parenting brand. My partner works every day except Thursdays and Fridays. He leaves at 5 a.m. and isn't home until 10 p.m. or so. I'm a stay-at-home mom. I feel like I'm always doing this alone, and it's pushed us away as a couple. His job allows me to be at home with our boy. However, I feel we are now like housemates who happen to have a child together. My husband works in trucking, but he's local, which sometimes doesn't make a difference when he's gone before we wake up and home when the kids are asleep. I'm exhausted. We have 3 kids, 9, 5, and 3 months. I'm busy nonstop and understand how much my husband works, but last night, after a very hectic evening with the kids and putting them to bed, I sat down to eat my dinner as usual, and it just hit me. I realized how many nights I spend alone eating dinner. I felt so lonely, but I know that I have a full house. My fiance works in the oil fields in Alaska, and we live in Alabama, so he's gone for 3 weeks and then he's home for 3 weeks. The 3 weeks he's gone definitely sucked big time. Feels like I'm a single mom. My husband works 6 or 7 days a week, 10 to 12 hours each day. We have 4 kids. We can't really plan a family day because he's always working. It stinks. Honestly, the more posts I read on these forums, the more I become convinced moms in the US live in an actual hellscape. So in this video, I want to explore this topic of stay-at-home moms more closely and help us rethink what stay-at-home moms really look like and this general stay-at-home mom paradox. This idea that kids will make you happy or complete you, and therefore you shouldn't complain about mom duties or the fact that you have to cook, clean, and do laundry, and take care of the household budgets, expenses, grocery bills, shopping, doctor appointments, etc., all while your husband gets to have a life outside of the home, albeit even if it's a stressful one. I also want to dispel this idea that stay-at-home moms are only wealthy white women who can survive off of one income, because that just erases the very real fact that many stay-at-home moms today are stay-at-home moms because they're poor and have little to no access to affordable childcare or higher education. Working class women and lower income women have always had to work across the board and didn't have the opportunity to stay home. But we've created such a hard economic landscape that today, lower income women have no choice but to stay home due to how terrible the economy is and in the rise of this sexist notion that that's where women belong. We'll be discussing all of this and more in part 1 from a historical and intersectional lens. Why do we have these gender spheres to begin with, and how for decades it was only middle class and wealthy white women who could ever come close to this housewife ideal, but who also, due to their whiteness and class status, were the most visible when fighting against these gender boxes. We'll also be talking about this constant state of capitalist flux American families seem to be in, where the alienation of male labor results in stricter gender norms for women. In part 2, we'll be delving into current family demographics in the US as more single women with kids are on the rise, as well as look into same-sex families and childcare takers of adult parents. Part 3 will have a heavier focus on cis-het married women with children today who either work or stay home and why it's so hard to have it all. Next, I want to talk about why trad wife mom influencers are so dangerous. And to be brief, the short answer is they enforce this myth that being a stay-at-home mom is a woman's only destiny, and push this idea that angry feminists are forcing women to work and shame housewives when that's not true. Women having their own source of income is vital, especially if they're in a financially unstable situation with kids, a scenario I unfortunately come across way too often on parenting/mom forums. Sure, it's not every woman's dream to be a girl boss or even have a career, and we shouldn't ostracize women who choose or want to stay at home. But then why shame women who want to work or have a career and kids in order to make sure they're financially stable and independent? As the Center of American Progress puts it, work is essential to women's economic security, social inequality, and a robust and sustainable economy for all. Lastly, I'll talk about where stay-at-home dads and work-from-home dads fit into all of this. Before I start this video, I just want to say that you should definitely check out Shane Spears' videos on trad wives as well as intellectual medias on history, specifically 80s history and 90s history. Their work is required viewing. All the links to my research are in the description below. So without further ado, let's get into it. It's going to be a long one. Before we take a look into today's modern families, let's first take a look into the history of the traditional, read white, American family. Elaine Tyler May, a U.S. historian, wrote in their article, Family Values, the Uses and Abuses of American Family History in 2003, that as a young nation, the U.S. lacked institutions where national identity typically derived from. Particularly, the U.S. back in 1776 lacked a rigid caste system based on a monarchy and aristocracy. She argues, lacking those characteristics, the United States invented its own traditions and placed the family in the center as the institution where citizens were bred and nurtured. Believing in the rights of the individual but fearful of tyranny from above as well as anarchy from below, the nation's founders invested in the institution of the family, the responsibility for maintaining social order in the democracy. When it came to women's roles in colonial society, historian Linda Kerber notes in her book Women of the Republic that the family was an important ideological and political institution in the founding of the nation. Domestic gender roles, particularly women's roles as mothers of future citizens, was central to the creation of a democratic society. Perhaps that is why the framers of the Constitution dismantled virtually all vestiges of old world hierarchies with the single exception of coverture, the common law practice that rendered a married woman politically and legally covered by her husband. As a femme covert, a married woman exercised her obligations to the state through her role as wife and mother in the family. So, white colonial families in the new nation began with puritanical marriages, and women had this expectation that they would nurture the home and the nation's future citizens, thus creating in theory these two distinct spheres where women work inside the home as mothers, educators, and caretakers, while the men work in politics, governing, and outside the home. And though there's this long-standing idea that this has always been the case since the nation's founding, it's not entirely true. As written in the Social History of the American Family, an encyclopedia, most white colonists were poor agrarian farmers who lived off the land in pretty bleak conditions, and thus all the labor and production done on the farm was equally valued and equally shared. Most colonists made their living in agriculture, either by owning and farming land or working on someone else's. The majority of colonists would have been considered self-employed but fairly poor. Life expectancy was around 45. Mortality, death rates were high at most stages, especially infancy. In these tumultuous times, a shortage of women resulted in high numbers of single men. Those who married formed what today's sociologists would call co-provider families. Essentially, the household was a place of production. Each member's labor was valued as it helped to sustain the family. Although this was clearly a patriarchal society with men having more legal power than women, wives' labor was valued as an economic contribution to the survival of the household, as was the husband's. Men sought strong, skilled wives who could make the journey across the country and/or endure the rigors of low-tech farming life. A gender division of labor existed, with men usually plowing and planting in the fields and hunting, and women tending to gardens and chickens, processing foods and milking cows. To bring in some cash, women and children often did piecework, such as sewing items for sale in the home. Thus, white settler families in the U.S., though subjugated women constitutionally, legally, and had gendered division of labor, the even more patronizing women's sphere wasn't prevalent just yet. Rather, everyone in a household had to work together, co-provide if you will, because if they didn't, they would die. And I just like to point out here that though we like to think of colonial women as being so demure and subservient to men, the majority of women weren't drinking tea in Williamsburg or going to balls, but working on farms with kids alongside their husbands. Women, especially poorer women, have always been essential laborers who never had it easier than men or just stayed indoors all day. Not to go off on a tangent, but it's even been noted that women were hunters as well as gatherers centuries and centuries ago. During colonial times and pre-Civil War, black women were enslaved by white families to do domestic duties by those white women who could afford it. According to Duke University, in 1860, 1% of white Southern families owned 200 or more human beings, but in states of the Confederacy, at least 20% owned at least one, and in Mississippi and South Carolina, it was as high as 50%. The domestic duties of enslaved black women included child rearing, laundering, cooking, cleaning, and at times, even working in the fields. Enslaved black children were forcibly sold like animals and ripped away from their families, all while their mothers were obligated to care for white children. This idea of being your own farm boss, producing for yourself, working side by side with your family wasn't one black families could take part in. Black enslaved women's labor wasn't their own, their bodies weren't their own, and neither were their children. The emergence of the woman's sphere wouldn't come about until the late 1800s with the rise of cities, the Industrial Revolution, and new technologies and factories. When it came to white families, many who had made their livelihood in farming and had expected their children would do the same were displaced by technological advancements that increased agricultural production while eliminating the need for so much human labor. Men who had seen themselves as autonomous, their own bosses, had to move to the city, where they attempted to sell their labor to new manufacturers in what seemed to them alienating working conditions. At first, women and children, especially among new European immigrants, took similar jobs. Though they were paid less, it is estimated that in a number of cities, children contributed to 20% of the family's income. Production became increasingly separated from the home, and the home became viewed as one's own private haven in a dog-eat-dog world. Thus, the normalization of factory life meant that production would leave the domestic sphere, the home, and be done elsewhere. It seems that with each era since then, the worker and the means of production have become more and more removed, and parallel to that, gender roles have become more and more strict. Husbands now worked outside the home instead of alongside their wives, as that's where the money was, and in theory, the women would stay home. The husband had to be out in the public sphere creating the wealth, but his wife was free to manage the private sphere, the woman's sphere. Enter the cult of domesticity. Together, a successful husband and wife created a picture of perfect harmony. As he developed skills for business, she cultivated a complementary role, mainly taking care of the children, the meals, the chores, and the household overall. During that time, the newly created roles for men and women were thought to reflect their true nature. A true man was concerned about success and moving up the social ladder. He was aggressive, competitive, rational, and channeled all of his time and energy into his work. A true woman, on the other hand, was virtuous. Her four chief characteristics were piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. She was the great civilizer who created order in the home in return for her husband's protection, financial security, and social status. Women's virtue was as much of a hallmark of Victorian society as materialism. As long as women functioned flawlessly within the domestic sphere and never venturing from it, women were held in reverence by their husbands and general society. But this was carried to ridiculous extremes. To protect young women's purity, certain words could not be spoken in their presence. Undergarments were unmentionables, a leg or an arm was called a limb, for example, and though the women's sphere seems patronizing, it was seen by many, including other women, as equally important. As written in Godey's Lady's book from 1856, The companion of man should be able thoroughly to sympathize with him. Her intellect should be as well developed as his. We do not believe in the mental inequality of the sexes. We believe that the man and the woman each have work to do, for which they are specially qualified, and in which they are called to excel. Though the work is not the same, it is equally noble and demands an equal exercise of capacity. The woman's sphere wasn't intended to be a bad thing, and in fact was seen as extremely vital work, which it very much is. Where the problem arises, however, is when staying home and childbearing and rearing and domestic duties are believed to just naturally be what women are best suited for, and that they're not suited for governing or running businesses or doing anything outside of the home, and even when they do work outside the home, they should get paid less for it. Women are irrational and illogical, but raising babies and children is their job. Make it make sense. In the end, the domestic sphere is important, but it isn't a woman's only place, because then it just starts to feel patronizing and infantilizing. Like throwing women a bone by saying, "You're so important," or "You're important too," but not actually meaning it, because you, as a man, would never do a woman's work, like take care of children, or wash dishes, or clean the house, do laundry, etc., because it's beneath you, no matter how hard you try to hype it up as important. During the early 1900s, when one woman, Anna Jarvis, tried to actually have a day to appreciate mothers and the woman's sphere, and who succeeded in 1908, but eventually she became so fed up with the holiday of Mother's Day due to its commercialization that she tried to have the whole thing cancelled. Jarvis once said, according to an article published in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch on Mother's Day in 1944, the telegraph companies with their ready-made greetings, the florists with their high-pressure campaigns and the awful prices, and the candy manufacturers and greeting card manufacturers have made a racket out of my ideas. The failure of Mother's Day, and at times even International Women's Day, in actually meaning anything for the status of women, particularly stay-at-home moms who society claims are so important, just speaks volumes to me. Before we move on from the Industrial Revolution, I want to add that this woman's sphere was more of an unattainable ideal than an actual real reality for most women. Millions of poor immigrant women and children worked in factories just as much as men. They just happened to make less money. During a Wisconsin Bureau of Labor investigation into a potato chip factory in 1902, the investigator noted, "The shops were open to every sort of objection. They were dirty, poorly ventilated, unheated, usually on the cramped second floor of a dilapidated building, and reached by steep, cluttered stairways." An inspector reported that, as the door was opened, it was at first impossible to see the sorters because of the clouds of dust. The investigator found it difficult to give an adequate picture without seeming to overstep the limits of the truth. Unless you were a rich married white woman with servants who were mostly black or immigrants, it was impossible to live up to this idea that you could stay at home and do all the housework and childcare by yourself. As historian Elaine Tyler May wrote, only the most privileged white Protestant women in the towns and cities had the resources that allowed them to devote themselves full time to nurturing their families and rearing future citizens. Their leisure time for moral uplift depended upon the labors of other women, enslaved black people, immigrant household servants, and working class women who toiled in factories to provide the goods and services that would enable privileged white women to pursue their role as society's moral guardians. And it was those very women, affluent and educated women, who had the time to organize and gather, who first rebelled against their constrained domestic roles, arguing that the system of coverture denied them their rights as citizens. The doctrine of coverture, this idea that women had no legal rights once they got married, was gradually abolished in the late 19th and early 20th century. In some cases, it had happened state by state. For example, in 1848, New York State passed the Married Women's Property Act. This allowed married women to own property in their name apart from their husbands. But it's important to note that these women who rebelled against the woman's sphere, for example, suffragists who fought for women's right to vote at the turn of the century, were primarily only fighting for white women's right to vote. Some white women suffragists were particularly angry when the 15th Amendment was passed in 1870, which gave black men the right to vote, as it was passed before the white women's right to vote in 1919. When suffragists gathered in Seneca Falls, New York in July 1848, they advocated for the right of white women to vote. The participants were middle-class and upper-class white women, a cadre of white men, and one African-American male, Frederick Douglass. The esteemed abolitionist had forged a strong working relationship with fellow abolitionists and white women suffragists, including Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. No black women attended the convention. Although black women were profoundly absent at Seneca Falls, a greater degree of cultural inclusion was on the horizon. African-American abolitionist Sojourner Truth spoke at a women's rights convention in Akron, Akron, Ohio in 1851. During her famous speech on the abolition of slavery and the promotion of women's rights, Truth allegedly bared her breast and proclaimed, "Ain't I a woman?" The feminist movement has a long history of racial exclusion that we shouldn't forget. I think it's also important to point out how white women racially benefited from the domestic sphere that was pioneered in the 1800s by being held up as pure and virtuous and morally upright and in need of protection from racial others. White women benefit from their perceived piety and purity and this representation of all that is good in a white man's world. This privilege is very seldom talked about when it comes to discussions about the domestic sphere and its history because it's not an easy past to confront, but it's crucial not to leave out the fact that white women never did their housework or child rearing alone. We can't forget about the racial hierarchy that subjugates black and brown women who up until recently never really got the chance to partake in this very white sphere of raising future citizens, namely because their kids weren't and still aren't seen as real citizens, but second-class ones who are disposable. With the Industrial Revolution, we can see this beginning of a pattern when it comes to women's roles as workers and mothers that has repeated itself in U.S. history time and time again. First, there's this alienation of labor leading to the solidifying of gender roles that suppress women, and then middle class and upper middle class white women living out that role realize that it doesn't make them happy. Next, they rebel against their patriarchal position, but leave marginalized women out of that conversation at least until the past few decades, as we'll get to later. This cycle would be seen again in the 1950s post-World War II, as women who once worked in factories were told to return to the home and given this unattainable ideal of being a perfect housewife. That, of course, made them all super happy. In More Work for Mother, Ruth Schwartz Cohen wrote that psychiatrists, psychologists, and popular writers of the era critiqued women who wished to pursue a career and even women who wished to have a job, referring to such unlovely women as lost, suffering from penis envy, ridden with guilt complexes, or just man-hating. Cohen highlights how during the 1950s and the resurgence of the cult of domesticity further shifted child-rearing and domestic work to women, mainly through this normalization of the happy housewife on shows like Leave It to Beaver, but also through targeted ads and consumerism for the latest appliances that showed how easy housework can be and how much companies cared about women's well-being.
Isn't it wonderful how this washer does all these heavy things?
Implying that a woman can and should do it all without complaint and all by herself. However, as many have suggested, this image of the suburban housewife, the white woman toiling away for her husband in the middle-class suburbs, leaves out a great many women. Primarily black women who worked as domestic servants and nannies and who had to leave the rich white towns before sundown due to racial segregation. Black women took care of white children in households since the founding of the U.S. and then continued to do so through the 1950s because of legalized racial segregation. It was essentially impossible for black people and families to integrate into society and achieve similar financial stability to white people until recently due to racism. Even though Betty Friedan's feminine mystique from 1963 was important in highlighting the way white suburban moms in New York and Long Island felt neglected, purposeless, and resentful, and that's a real problem, there's also no accountability in their benefiting from a racial hierarchy, even during one of the largest women's liberation movements in history. White women weren't doing it alone, and this techno-fascist fantasy where the white upper class can rid themselves of their role in racial oppression through buying the latest appliance never fully manifested. Though you can't say companies didn't try to totally get rid of black domestic servants by trying to automate their jobs. Honestly, if there weren't home technological advancements, I don't know if white women would ever feel so bored with their lives if they could still subjugate black women. Today, black and brown women continue to be employed as caregivers, primarily to the elderly in nursing homes. Since the 1970s, black women who worked as domestic servants were moved to the healthcare sector, and the effects of this can still be felt today. In the journal article Structural Racism and Black Women's Employment in the U.S. Healthcare Sector, Janet Dill and Mignon Duffy wrote, "Black women have the highest probability of working in the long-term care sector, 37%, and in licensed practical nursing or aid occupations, 42%. Our findings link black women's position in the labor force to the historical legacies of sexism and racism dating back to the division of care work in slavery and domestic service. In general, it's easy just to focus on the dominant image of the white college-educated 1950s housewife who left college at 19 to get married and have kids, because then we don't need to think about the ways in which those middle and upper-class white women also benefited from the labor of black domestic workers who never really had a choice on whether they could pursue higher education and leave the domestic sphere, because they were at times born into it. I want to acknowledge that this is a slippery slope, and it's easy to start playing like the oppression Olympics on who had or has it worse and whose struggle is really valid, but in reality we shouldn't compare because they're incomparable. The point of highlighting the differences in these histories and racial hierarchy is to point out how women's issues encompass not just one type of woman. During the 1960s, second wave feminism had a very narrow focus. This meant that the perspectives of lower class women or women of color were not considered. Betty Friedan, the author of The Feminine Mystique, even went as far as calling lesbian women one of feminism's foremost internal threats, which attempted to isolate homosexual women from the feminist movement. Because these beliefs excluded those women who were not white, heterosexual, and middle class, it's clear that second wave feminist thought did not include an intersectional perspective. However, this doesn't mean that black women weren't at the forefront of the 1960s women's movement. The Montgomery bus boycott wouldn't have been possible without the support of black domestic workers. During the boycott, many chose to walk to their employers' homes instead of riding the bus, which caused them to arrive at work late and, in many circumstances, fatigued. Many white employers unintentionally helped the boycott because they had to pick up their black domestic workers who refused to take public transportation. Movement scholars have argued that because over half of the black women workers in Montgomery during the boycott were employed in white households, the boycott simply would not have succeeded without their support.
Now, I'm going to bring him a cup of coffee just like he brought me a cup of coffee this morning. And that, young man, is what marriage is made of. It is give and take 50-50. And if you don't get it together and drop these macho attitudes, you are never going to have anybody bringing you anything, anywhere, any place, anytime, ever.
In the 1980s and 90s, the cult of domesticity seemed to finally be abolished. The gender role issues women were facing in the 80s were vastly different than those in the 50s, as by this time, most Americans were comfortable having female doctors, lawyers, mayors, and bosses, and the number of women attending college surpassed men. The decade also narrowed the wage inequality gap. In 1979, women made on average 58 cents for every dollar a man made. By 1994, the average woman made 72 cents for every dollar a man made. However, there was still a racial pay gap between women. In 1989, white women working full-time made a median weekly wage of $334, while black women made $301, and Latina women made $269. Women in the 1980s were still employed in traditionally low-salaried jobs such as clerical service or factories, but they were also moving into other segments. On top of that, there was this notion that a woman could have it all, and though we should support a woman's career, she should still be a mother and do domestic work, which made family life, particularly married life, very stressful. Women were expected to give 100% of themselves at work and at home. Yet, this was not sustainable. Men began doing more housework and childcare during the 80s, but studies show that it was not significant. Sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild studied the division of household chores in her book, The Second Shift, published in 1989. She concluded that while some men had stepped up their game, women performed approximately 15 more hours of household work per week, or one additional month of work per year. When the activists of the 1960s fought to liberate women, they envisioned a world with flexible workplaces where both partners could enjoy professional success, homes where both partners shared in the responsibilities, and a government or corporations that would provide childcare. However, they did not envision a world where everything would stay the same and where women would have to do more to succeed. Yes, women were allowed to have lives outside of the home and even given credit cards in their own name apart from their husbands as of 1974. But almost nothing at a systemic or cultural level changed for them. The government during the 1980s was extremely conservative. The idea of a free public option for healthcare, maternity leave, and childcare was out of the question. And though women seemed to win in their fight for entering the outer influential sphere of business and politics, when they spoke out about workplace harassment, they were silenced. Anita Hill was infamously dismissed by an all-male panel of politicians when she called out Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas for sexual assault. The 1990s third-wave feminist movement, despite pushback from Republicans, did make significant gains, however, in that by 1993 there was a federal law against all forms of marital rape, a fight that had begun in the 1970s. In addition, professor and civil rights advocate Kimberly Michelle Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality, which she introduced in 1989, took hold, and the ways different women see the world was finally considered, not just white, middle class, and upper class, Protestant, cis-het married women. So now that we are fully fleshed out in the history of the origin of the housewife as well as their fight against the domestic sphere, let's take a look at where modern families are today, and then more specifically how stay-at-home moms and working moms are holding up. Before we get into the current state of stay-at-home moms and cis-het married women with children, let's talk about other family dynamics, as the typical 1950s nuclear family, though still the majority in the U.S., is far from the only type of family there is. According to the U.S. Census Bureau in 2020, about 2/3 of all U.S. households were family households, the same share a decade earlier. Married couples accounted for about 71% of these households. However, the census showed that the biggest increases among non-family households were male householders living alone and female householders who were not living alone but with children. Single women households with children have continued to rise since the introduction of no-fault divorces during the 1970s. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, as of 2020, out of 10 million single-parent families with children under the age of 18, almost 80% were headed by single mothers, a third lived in poverty. Today, 1 in 5 children under the age of 18, a total of about 15.7 million children, are being raised without a father. Around half, 51.4% of single mothers, have never married. Almost a third, 29%, are divorced, and about 2/3 are white and 1/3 are black. At any one time, about 2/3 of single mothers, or 73%, are working outside the home as they can't afford to work and provide for their children without a partner. This is a slightly greater share than the share of married mothers who are also working outside the home, which is 67%. However, only half of single mothers were employed full-time year-long. About 1 in 5, 20%, were jobless the entire year. 41 were employed in low-wage jobs. Even if a single mother is able to work, her earning power still lags significantly compared with men's, about 83 cents to $1 for the same job, leaving a wage gap of 17 cents on the dollar. A single mother's average income is $51K a year, while married couples make around $106K a year. As someone who was raised by a single mother, these statistics are painfully familiar. Thankfully, I lived in a multi-generational home with my grandmother, but this isn't the norm, especially in white households. Overall, only 7% of households reported being multi-generational, with 3 or more generations living under one roof. Non-white people in the U.S. are more likely to live with 3 or more generations under one roof. Nearly 20% of all Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander households are multi-generational. Among white households, it's 5%. And honestly, having a large family community supporting one another is necessary under a system that makes child rearing a one-person or at most a two-person job. It takes a village to raise a child, but in the US, it's the cultural norm to kick your kids out at 18 or even sadder, make them start paying rent. Along with the rise of single mothers, there's also been an uptick in child caregivers for parents or adult family members like grandparents. As of 2005, 1.4 million children ages 8 to 18 provide care for an adult relative. 72% are caring for a parent or grandparent, and 64% live in the same household as their care recipient. Fortunately, most of these children are not the sole caregiver. However, it is expected, especially for non-white households that are more likely to be multi-generational, for the older siblings to help out, especially the older daughters, in both adult caretaking and sibling caretaking. Economists Pamela Jacquiela and Owen Ozier of Williams College in Massachusetts studied this phenomenon of children taking care of other children. Seen through the lens of the younger child, it's charming to have an older sister taking care of them. But this uneven burden of care work has real costs for older girls. For instance, it often means they have less time for their own schoolwork and play. Because of how the U.S. is set up with little to no childcare, stigmatization of asking for help with parenting, which is seen as a private personal matter, a lot of the time the older daughters have to help with household duties and child rearing to help their mom out. And in the U.S., non-white immigrant women are more likely to be stay-at-home moms. The Institution for Women's Policy Research calculated from the 2013 American Community Survey that immigrant women are less likely than U.S.-born women to be in the labor force, 56.2% compared with 59%. While many immigrant women are thriving in the workforce, others encounter challenges that hinder their participation or limit their access to higher quality employment. These challenges include the same barriers that all women face, such as under-evaluation of work performed predominantly by women and the lack of work-family infrastructures, and often additional challenges as well, such as limited English proficiency, and for those who are undocumented, lack of access to legal status. From a 2015 earnings study by the IWPR, more than 1 in 4 immigrant women in the U.S. has a bachelor's or advanced degree, compared with 30% of U.S.-born women. Among the 10 largest sending countries of female immigrants, Mexico, the Philippines, China, India, Vietnam, Korea, El Salvador, Cuba, and the DR and Canada, immigrant women from India, the Philippines, and Korea are the most likely to have a bachelor's degree or higher. Some immigrant women who have college degrees, however, find that their qualifications are not recognized in this country and can only find low-skilled, low-paying jobs. Immigrant women also make less than their male counterparts. As for LGBTQ+ families, there were about 1.2 million same-sex couples in the U.S. in 2021, according to the Census Bureau data. Roughly 710,000 of the same-sex couple households were married and about 500,000 were unmarried. Among children living with a mother who had a same-sex partner or spouse, 12% lived in a household below the poverty level, compared to 9% of those with a father in a same-sex relationship and 10% of those with a parent in male-female relationships. In 2004, of 9,328 same-sex couples with children whose census returns were randomly selected for analysis by the Census Bureau, 26% of male couples included a stay-at-home parent. So, to conclude, if you're living in any other type of living arrangement other than a cis-het US-born marriage, you're more likely to live below the poverty line, receive less government benefits, and face significant amounts of employment discrimination. And though the prevalence of differing family dynamics is growing, specifically working-class single mothers and LGBTQ+ families, the government has not done much, if anything, to facilitate that change, and in fact has begun to crack down on LGBTQ+ people and their rights and education, as well as enforce this harmful rhetoric that women are being too selfish and should just settle for men who treat them like shit. So now let's look into the current state of cishet women in marriages with kids at home and at work, who make up 2/3 of all U.S. households. Today we're living in the current fourth wave era of feminism. Feminists continue to fight for reproductive rights, closing the pay gap, maternity leave, and an end to sexual harassment. The newest wave of the women's movement also pushes back against this persistent myth that women should stay home, take care of the kids, their husbands, the house, and shut up about it. We want the right to choose if we become mothers, if we get married, and even if we have a career. Lastly, we realize that in order to have it all, a career and kids, we need a community and government intervention. We need support of men helping us along if we choose to get married to one, to help us out at work, and to treat us with respect. Having it all doesn't mean doing it all. But unfortunately, in the modern US, this idea of the independent family unit where everyone does their share alone and without complaint is extremely prevalent, as it helps to uplift this American ideal, where you pull yourself up by your bootstraps and remain self-sufficient, even if you're a mother, which makes zero sense. Becoming a parent takes a village, but in the US, any sense of a village is demonized, and any asking for government support is you being lazy. And if you're wondering where this dangerous notion comes from, that families and mothers should operate independently rather than being communal, you can thank Ronald Reagan. Reagan shifted the relationship between the family and the state once again, placing the responsibility for society's welfare on the family, not the federal government, and retreating from the policies of Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson. Derogatory stereotypes from welfare queens to deadbeat dads reflected the prevailing notion that citizens' responsibilities to society were tied to their family roles. According to Reagan, threats to the nation emerged from feminists who allegedly shirked their domestic roles, and welfare mothers, usually represented as black even though most women on welfare were white, who eschewed marriage in favor of the dole. The antidote, once again, was the nuclear family and traditional family values, which of course harkens back all the way to the 1800s, as we just talked about in part 1. When the world is chaotic, go into the comfort of your own home where your mom is there with a bowl of warm soup right where she's supposed to be. And if you can't do that or don't do that, then get out of the kitchen. If you can't do it all, have a career and be financially independent, as well as be an independent mother who doesn't nag her husband or political leaders for support, then don't be one. So due to this lack of help and this dangerous ideal that you should be self-sufficient even while doing the job of raising kids, which is inherently communal, many women decide that they need to stay home and give up working. I'd only have 6 weeks maternity leave anyway. All my income would go to childcare. What's the point of working? What if my child gets sick? Will I have enough sick leave to take care of them? If husbands bring in more money, it makes sense for lower income women to stay home. Like we mentioned before, it's more likely for either extremely wealthy women to stay home or extremely poor women. But it's the women living in poverty that need to save up more, that don't have domestic help, that feel the pressure of being a mom more than those on the other end of the spectrum. Along with this notion of rugged individualism and economic constraints, some women decide to become stay-at-home moms because they and their male spouses have internalized this long persisting sexist notion that women just are more nurturing and biologically programmed to be better parents, as well as more fit for doing laborious tasks like cooking, washing dishes, and sweeping. It's all of these combined factors that have increased the amount of stay-at-home moms in the US. As of 2023, nearly a quarter, 25% of American mothers now identify as stay-at-home parents, a sharp rise from the 15% in 2022. Like I mentioned in section 1, there's this cycle that seems to crop up every 30 to 50 years or so, which is that the rise of alienation of male labor leads to more rigid gender roles, which then leads to more women staying home, which then leads to anxiety and civil unrest among women. The rise of work alienation due to COVID and most people working bullshit jobs that they find no meaning in, the lack of any real connection to a community due to hyper-individualism and a lack of third spaces and car culture has bred online communities of stay-at-home moms who have had to give up their jobs or who are in financially precarious relationships with men who they and their children become wholly dependent on. It's a recipe for disaster and a situation that is ripe for men to abuse. And it just makes me sad that after years of fighting for women's rights to have lives outside of the domestic sphere, that here we are again right back to where we started. Though women have credit cards now and coverture laws aren't a thing anymore, it just seems like things haven't really changed. Even if you are a woman with a career, with a stay-at-home husband, you're still seen as the primary caretaker and housekeeper. Women do much more work in the house than men, even when they out-earn their husband, says Kate Mangino, a gender expert and the author of Equal Partners, Improving Gender Equality at Home. The effect is that some women report not being able to reach their professional and income potential. They feel like they can't volunteer for that trip, even if it might lead to a promotion because of the work at home. Husbands, meanwhile, have hours of extra time each week to spend on leisure work, Pew found. That allows men endless opportunities, according to Mangino. The husband can learn a hobby, he could sleep, he could go back to school or take a class that could make more money in the future. And if you know how hard it is to take care of a newborn even with help, it's exhausting. Newborns can't sleep by themselves, poop by themselves, pass gas by themselves, eat by themselves. They can't even sit up until around 6 months of age, and yet women are told in the US that they should be ready to go back to work after 6 weeks. How are women who want to breastfeed, which is recommended until 6 months to 2 years of age, supposed to do that if they have to be back at work after a month and a half? Sleep in and of itself is a huge struggle for the first year, and this leads to the phenomenon of cry it out or controlled crying and sleep training in the US, with mothers letting their babies learn to self-soothe at young ages in order for them to fall asleep on their own. This is controversial in other parts of the world where co-sleeping and soothing your baby to sleep is the norm. This is one of the most contentious issues on parenting forums today, but a big reason why US mothers resort to controlled crying is because they need to sleep in order to work the next day if they want to keep their job and income and remain financially independent. Sometimes I think about how in the past, at least in other cultures like in ancient China, women would be sent off to their marital homes with a dowry that would consist of valuables that their husbands would usually leave for their wives. But if they were bad husbands, they would take the dowry for themselves. But usually the husband would let their wife keep this small fortune for themselves, as the women, usually middle and upper class women, wouldn't be able to work and had bound feet. And sometimes I compare this to the status of women today. Women who have no inherited wealth but are in the same position, married off, no family in sight, and this time with no dowry, no valuable possessions, just their limited education, and who now have to depend on their husband for an allowance. Yes, believe it or not, some women have to receive an allowance from their husband because they don't work, rather than a what's mine is yours policy. So these moms on their allowance buy themselves a little coffee treat now and then, and that alone is a big deal. It's really bleak. I know not all women want to have careers, and that's fine, but even having a little job outside the home is crucial in order not to be dependent on others. What if your husband gets sick? What if they die? What if they become violent? What's the backup plan? Most women, I'm sure, have happy marriages and partnerships and support groups, but not all. Earning one's own income under a capitalist system is sadly the only way to ever really be free, and a lifestyle that has only recently become available to women of marginalized racial backgrounds. But some people say, isn't being a housewife enough? Isn't it just a blessing to be a mom and stay at home while your husband takes care of the finances? Where's your gratitude? Why are you complaining about being able to stay home with your kids? And like other waves of feminism, there's always been a conservative backlash, but this time the conservative backlash comes from online trad wives who say that women should be happy with their biologically destined role of mother and wife, but who themselves are paid influencers. So let's talk about it. Now I want to take a closer look into trad wife mom influencers who are pushing this conservative agenda online that being a stay-at-home mom and wife is this beautiful thing women get to do, and the angry feminists telling you to get a job are wrong. So first off, I want to say that generally I understand where this pushback is coming from. As I've already stated, women's work is undervalued and underappreciated, and historically has largely been done by Black and brown women who are already viewed as less than and treated as second-class citizens, even by their white female peers. And women today who stay at home aren't just on their phones all day. They're doing housework, bathing and changing diapers, making meals, breastfeeding, pumping, etc. So I get why there's this urge to talk about housework and the crucial role of domestic labor and the women who do it. The glorification of stay-at-home momming is purposeful to dispel this myth that stay-at-home moms don't do anything. Women who take care of the children and domestic duties need to be valorized and seen as important, and not in a paternal, commercial, or patronizing way, but actually through government intervention by giving stay-at-home moms stipends for their labor, so they're not dependent on their husbands, and so they could afford childcare if they need it. Not to mention giving an increase in labor protections and wages for Black and brown women in domestic care and caregiving roles. It's also important to raise awareness about how stay-at-home moms aren't just upper-class, well-off white women, but also Black and brown immigrant, lower-class, struggling women. But in fact, this is a big reason why these government benefits don't exist. White supremacy doesn't allow it to. Politicians and government officials say it's because they don't want to give wealthy people who could afford X, Y, or Z handouts, but it's actually because they don't want to help those at the bottom. Another reason why I get this trad wife thing is because women aren't a monolith. Some women are happy to be stay-at-home moms and do their patriarchal role and take care of the domestic sphere, and that's fine. Women are autonomous human beings and who do things intentionally and with purpose. And sometimes being a stay-at-home mom is what they want to do, and they do it with pride. If they find joy in household and motherly duties, let them. Taking care of a house and kids is satisfying. It can be personally fulfilling, but that also doesn't pay the bills. Where I do draw the line is at this idea that there's some angry blue-haired feminist agenda forcing women to go out and be girl bosses, and that feminism is ripping us as women away from femininity and where we truly belong. As if stay-at-home moms are victims not of the patriarchy but of feminists who are obligating young women not to have kids, not to get married, and not to stay at home. When, like we already discussed, the main reason for feminism is to give women options and also valorize women's minds and work both in and outside the home. But these conservative trad wives believe that it's the liberal woman's agenda to ruin the sanctity of the family by being educated in birth control, bodily autonomy, and that no, not everyone dreams about being a mother or pleasing a husband. has-been. I get that the commercialization of the girl boss was all-encompassing, and not all women have dream jobs. But again, staying at home, though fulfilling, won't help you when your bills are late, or when you end up in financial debt because the main breadwinner is out of commission. Tradwife ideology purposefully puts women at a disadvantage in order to serve the patriarchy. Though I think it's good we go against that reduction of girl boss feminism, being stay-at-home moms and returning to the woman's sphere isn't the answer. And yet, this conservative content seems to be extremely popular, mainly because a lot of it isn't outright conservative, but as Katie Couric's website says, tradwives claim their lifestyle is about paying homage to a slower, more intentional lifestyle. It's about romanticizing the past, not pushing a modern agenda. Easy for white women to say. Ballerina Farm's Hannah Nealman, with 9 million followers, is a mother of 7 who rarely ever videotapes herself outside of her Utah farm as a tradwife. As far as tradwives go, Nealman is largely unproblematic in the absence of hashtags, let alone spoken words. The ideologies underlying her traditional lifestyle are relatively inconspicuous. However, when I discovered who she really is, the daughter-in-law of JetBlue founder David Nealman, who boasts a net worth of $400 million, her silence felt more like an intentional choice to obscure the perception of her family's affluence. Another tradwife influencer, Esty Williams, who has 118,000 followers, embodies the ideologically driven 1950s tradwife. Williams's content centers on sharing the Christian, anti-feminist, anti-college, submissively feminine beliefs that underpin her calling to the tradwife life. In one of her pinned videos, Williams details her rules for marriage, the highlights of which include never leaving the house after dark by herself, no opposite-sex friendships, biblically submitting to and serving her husband, and styling herself according to her husband's preferences. One look at the hashtags Williams uses across her videos will tell you everything you need to know about what kind of audience she wishes to reach. By using the hashtag #MakeWivesGreatAgain, Williams makes a less than understated allusion to the former president's infamous campaign slogan, which has become the linchpin of the far-right, white nationalist movements across the country. Similarly, hashtag Revolt Against the Modern World represents yet another example of Williams' ultra-conservative outreach. In this case, she references a 1934 book written by Giulia Savola, an Italian fascist who gained a cult-like following in radically right-wing circles during the aftermath of the 2016 election. These influencers work along a spectrum from either conservative right to alt-light to alt-right tradwives, but no matter their place on this spectrum, they're subtly trying to recruit people, mainly disgruntled poor white women who have no choice but to stay home to the right. They do this by glorifying the domestic sphere, by saying how happy you could be or should be in it, and tapping into this anxiety and fear about the modern world. Rightfully, they do talk about how hard it is to be a woman who has to do it all, but they suggest giving that up for biological essentialism rather than solidarity with other women. One of the most insidious things they do, to me at least, is pushing homeschooling and sowing this distrust in your community. I recently came across an Instagram video where a tradwife influencer was talking about how I can't believe we send our kids off to strangers for 8 hours a day in order to push homeschooling. And one commenter rightfully said, they don't have to be strangers. You as a parent, for the sake of your kids' well-being, need to be in community with other parents, teachers, caregivers, etc. It's not this thing that you do alone. Kids need a group of trusted adults to go to when they need to. That's not just mom and dad. But in the US, at least, when it comes to conservatism, that is seen as wrong, and other people, even teachers, are seen as strangers, not people who work their whole lives to educate children. It's just so odd to me how you wouldn't want your kid exposed to new ideas other than your own, but that's what conservatism is fighting against. Public schools, liberal art colleges, etc., as they see them as recruitment grounds for the left. In a Republican's mind, you can't trust the government institutions, not even schools. You can only trust your nuclear family, and that family should be totally self-sufficient, and not even as a mom should you depend on anyone but yourself. Pick your own food, school your own kids, when in reality, wealthy white people never did it on their own without the labor of black and brown caregivers. Glorifying the past is pushing a modern agenda, an agenda of wanting to go back in time when white people were unquestioningly right and supreme, and white women were coddled, or at least in theory. They really were not doing that well mentally or financially, but I guess we'll forget about that. This isn't to say that women dream of labor, that all women want to have careers and work 8 hours a day and be away from their home and kids, but rather that they don't and shouldn't have to do it all by themselves. All the housework, all the child rearing, and holding down a job in case things go bottoms up. There's this Communist Party phrase from China, I know, but let me finish, that women hold up half the sky, and that echoes these separate but equal spheres we have in the US. But if women really are equal to men, then men also need to help women. Husbands need to start valorizing their wives outside of their role of just being a wife and mother, and government officials need to fight for women's rights, maternity leave, childcare, etc., instead of just working to ban TikTok. So let's talk about some men who are stepping up and becoming stay-at-home dads. So what about the stay-at-home dads? As women increasingly earn more money than men, they become the sole breadwinners in some households. Since the 1990s, women have surpassed men in receiving bachelor's degrees each year. The number of women pursuing higher education continually increased over the last 40 years. The numbers outpace men in both college enrollment and graduation. Caregiving costs have dramatically escalated, making it less financially worthwhile to have both parents working outside the home. When you factor in the cost of hiring a nanny, sending your kid to daycare, and elderly care with the expenses of commuting back and forth to an office, it makes sense for one parent to opt out of the workforce and stay home. Men are decidedly working from home, working part-time, or giving up working altogether in order to take on household and caregiving duties stereotypically done by women. Similar to the financial crisis era, many men left the workforce during the pandemic and have not returned. As of last month, over 7 million men between the ages of 25 and 54 are not working or looking for work. In the US, for example, the number nearly doubled from 1989 to 2012, but they're still relatively unusual. Of US families with opposite-sex married parents, 5.6 have working mothers and non-working fathers, compared to the 28.6 with working fathers and non-working mothers. It's worth noting that this includes people who are unemployed but may be seeking work, so it's an imperfect estimate. In the EU, it's ever rarer. About 1 in 100 men pause their careers for at least 6 months for childcare, compared to 1 in 3 women. One BBC article who interviewed both European and US stay-at-home fathers noted, the relative rarity means that men who make this choice can feel like the odd ones out, and sometimes are judged harshly. Even in cultures where fathers are expected to be more involved than in the past, they still are expected to be the breadwinners of the family and are frequently stereotyped as less nurturing or domestically adept than mothers. One Black American father, Eric Taylor, said, I feel like sometimes I'm being watched by some kind of male oversight hierarchy group somewhere that's watching me and keeping tabs and saying, why do you do the dishes so much? Even though Taylor does contribute financially to his family, he's sometimes pricked by guilt over not being the main breadwinner. I struggle with feeling like I'm not providing for my family, he says. I internally struggle with, are you that guy that just stays home? This kept guy who is maintained by your wife while she goes out and brings home the bacon, illustrating how these strict gender norms and spheres hurt not only women but men. Believe it or not, they can be just as capable as parents and at taking care of the house, cooking, doing laundry, etc. It's honestly ridiculous how we've divided the boring household chores as just women's work, as if men are incapable of taking care of the home in which they also live. As someone who grew up within a wealthy suburb, this dynamic isn't surprising to me, even though I still held this bias that stay-at-home moms were rich and pampered. My friends growing up all had working moms whose husbands stayed home and raised the kids, picked them up from school, did the dishes, vacuuming, and were highly involved in their kids' lives. And honestly, it's a welcome change. Of course, whoever's out there bringing home the metaphorical bacon feels guilty for not helping out with the kids, and vice versa. But now it at least seems there's equal opportunity missing out and guilt. So gains are being made, but systemically there's still a long way to go, not to mention sociocultural norms that need to change. For example, when dads do something, it's like, whoa, you're such a good father. Versus when moms do something, it's like, whatever, you're a mom, you're supposed to do that. There's this expectation that since dads don't have to do anything, when they do, it's like they really care rather than just doing their share of parenting. Lastly, we really need to end the stigma when it comes to different family dynamics. Single parents, same-sex parents, interracial parents, they all have struggles, especially in a racist, homophobic, individualistic society. Lastly, we need to stop the pressure of women having kids because not all women want to have kids. If you don't want to have kids, you should not have kids. So that's it for this video. Overall, married women with kids who stay at home are having a rough time right now, but especially poorer women who are less likely to be educated and more likely to be dependent on their partner financially, which, no matter how loving, is still a precarious position to be in when you are forced out of the workforce for years because the government can't give women free childcare. The US is one of the wealthiest countries in the world without healthcare, without maternity leave, without job security for mothers. No wonder why the birth rate is falling. And tradwife ideology is far from the answer. And honestly, to me, just wants to bring back a form of white supremacy where white women were uplifted as the only true women while black women took care of their houses and children. This doesn't mean that white wealthy suburban housewives had or have no real complaints because the patriarchy affects all of us. And what a lot of white women tradwives forget to tell their audiences is that white women in the past were extremely unhappy and unfulfilled even with being rich and with black domestic servants. And that's the point I really want to drive home. Even women who supposedly had it all ended up unhappy with their patriarchal designated role from the 1800s to the 50s to today. So what would make you think that implementing that cult of domesticity now would be any different? You have to use your critical thinking skills. What mothers need is support from their communities, their governments, and their husbands. Less alienation from the community, and more getting to know people around you, your neighbors, teachers, and other parents, because no one can raise a child alone. Shout out to the stay-at-home dads and to the dads that step up and to dads who don't feel emasculated by their wives who make more than them. Let them be examples for all the angry single men out there who say women today are too picky, too selfish, and too high maintenance. So that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching, and if you're a mom struggling out there, I hope this made you feel better and less alone. It's rough out there. So please give this video a like or a comment if you have something to say, or share it with someone, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.